So you want to know more about the comprehensive high school. Let's dive into this stack of books and see what we've got. First up, we have William Reese's The Origins of the American High School. Now this is the go-to if you want a very flavorful romp through the history of the early days of the high school in the 19th century. Next up, you could check out The Irony of Early School Reform by Michael Katz. He takes a look at the particular controversy around the abolition of the Beverly High School in Massachusetts around 1860, analyzing the vote, and comes to the somewhat controversial conclusion that it was the rich foisting the high school upon the poor. Now, Michael Katz was part of this new wave of revisionist educational historians who got their training in the late 60s, early 70s, and were really starting to shake things up in the often relatively tame realm of the history of education. So it's a good one if you want to get a glimpse into some of those controversies. Do make sure to follow up with some of the later treatises that attack Michael Katz for this argument. Now, one of Michael Katz's students was David Labrie, and his first book is The Making of an American High School, which examines Philadelphia's Central High. Now, Labrie takes a look at the credentials market in Philadelphia, trying to explain how the high school diploma becomes this highly sought-after credential, not just by people who want to go to college, but the children of artisans, of working class people who are also demanding access. And he examines how that changes the high school and the labor market in this sort of intertwined relationship. His more recent work includes this book, Someone Has to Fail, the zero-sum game of public schooling. And that's a good work if you want to get a relatively provocative thesis about how little it actually does for society by adding on all these layers of education, all these layers of credentialing, how, in his words, it becomes a zero-sum game. Now, if you want a more archivally informed, careful study of the school building process in the late 19th and early 20th century, then check out School, Society, and State, A New Education to Govern Modern America from 1890 to 1940 by Tracy Steffs. And in this book, Steff helps inform us about how the school becomes so central to the way government is operating, particularly at the state and local level, how it interacts with the broad array of government and progressive era reforms that are going on. Now, if you prefer regression analysis in order to understand the relationship between America's schools and the American economy, then definitely this book is for you. The Race Between Education and Technology by Claudia Goldin and Lawrence Katz. We touched on this briefly in one of the videos for this module, but if you take a look and do a deep dive on this book, it will give you all the details you want about how they come to the conclusion that the high school in America was so crucial to the economic growth that took place in the 20th century. Now, in this heavily numerical vein is Joel Perlman's book, Ethnic Differences, Schooling and Social Structures Among the Irish, Italians, Jews, and Blacks in an American City, 1880 to 1935. And in his analysis, Perlman finds that even just attending school, much less graduating from it, gave members of these ethnic immigrant groups a big leg up in the job market. They ended up getting a great economic return in many respects, unless they were African American, partly because of the racially segregated labor market that existed in the South in particular, but also through much of the United States. Now, one of the pioneering studies of black education, and particularly if we take a look at the role that industrial education played for African Americans in the South, is this book by James D. Anderson, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935. And particularly on this subject of the high school, Anderson does a great job of showing how white philanthropists were trying to use the high school to, in his words, reproduce caste in the urban South as they were introduced. Now, more recently, scholars like Adam Faircloth in the book A Class of Their Own, Black Teachers in the Segregated South, and Catherine Sharon in her biography of civil rights leader Septima Clark have examined how African American educators delicately navigated this system to find a way to make this curriculum much more liberating than white philanthropists and the white superintendents had intended. Now, we are still far from where we want to be in terms of equalizing the racial educational gap. But we've made a lot of progress, and documenting much of the reasons for why that progress was made is this book from John Rury and Shirley Hill, The African American Struggle for Secondary Schooling 1940 through 1980. Still, what about women in high school? That's a question that's taken up by David Tyack and Elizabeth Hansett in this book, Learning Together, A History of Co-Education in American Schools. And in it, you can get a better sense about how the high school becomes co-educational, and also see that women are actually outperforming men in many respects, even by the early 20th century, in terms of how they do in their classes and their graduation rates. Now, most of the books that I've just piled over there have been written from the 1970s and onward, but remember that newer isn't always better. There are some golden classics out there, among them this set by Edward Krug, The Shaping of the American High School. And it is a detailed compendium, does a very good job chronologically walking you through how it is that we institutionalize the high school in America. The good things to read are not only the secondary sources, there are many great primary sources out there, especially the many reports that have been written to try to mold and shape the high school into something. Now, some noteworthy reports in this regard include the NEA's 1893 report from its Committee of 10 on Secondary School Studies, the Douglas Commission report from 1905 on industrial and technical education in Massachusetts, the Cardinal Principles of Secondary Schooling report of 1918, and a more recent example, this was published in 1959, it's James B. Conant's The American High School Today, a first-hand report to interested citizens. Conant was one of a long line of Harvard presidents who thought it was their responsibility and duty to mold and reshape the public education system. And you can get a glimpse about what the problems of the high school were considered to be in the 1950s here. Perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not, the problems of the high school often flip. In this time, Conant thought the problem was that high schools weren't big enough. Only 30 or 40 years later, the problem was that high schools were too big. So we have these sorts of pendulum swings when it comes to the history of educational reform. Now, this represents just a fraction of the many great works out there on the comprehensive high school and its origins. So get to reading.